Good morning. Welcome to our St. Stephen's Sunday Forum, our kickoff for this fall. We're so glad to have you all here in the parish hall with us, and as well as on YouTube this morning. Most of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Becky Watts. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Outreach here at St. Stephen's, and so we're really pleased to have you with us this morning. Our speaker, as you know, for this morning is John Archibald. He's an op-ed columnist with Alabama Media Group, including for Birmingham Times. I was just moved by his book, Shaking the Gates of Hell, this spring, and thought it would be lovely to have him come as a speaker, and he was willing to come and share some of his stories and reflections with us. And so we are really pleased to have you here with us today. So welcome to St. Stephen's.
Thank you so much. It's I hope that I have gotten very tired of talking about myself a lot. So, which people who know me would say is impossible for me to get tired of doing that. But I hope more than anything in this that these can be conversations, because the whole point of the book is that we find ways to talk about things that we have often been too reluctant to talk about, and find ways to talk about them, frankly, that are productive, as opposed to what we too often see on Twitter, for instance, and whatnot. But, it's hard to talk about race these days. I guess it's hard, really. I guess it's always been hard to talk about race in a lot of ways. Of course, it's been hard to talk about a lot of things, particularly in the South. Dirty laundry, mental health, depression, embarrassments, weaknesses, LGBTQ issues. The things that aren't expected of us are often hard. And now, as someone who was born in 1963 and never quite understood exactly the nature of what was going on, never quite understood how people could be so resistant, never understood how, you see the pictures of white people in mobs beating people on trailways buses, and as somebody who was born in that era and started schools in 1970, 69, 70, in integrated classrooms, it was always very difficult for me to understand, and sadly, I feel like more in the last couple of years that I can understand 1963 more than I ever did before, and I find that to be really sad. And now people don't want us, now we can't turn on the news without finding out that people don't really want us to talk about history that much, because a lot of people think it makes us unpatriotic to talk about the things that went on before, and I don't think it makes us unpatriotic at all to acknowledge the flaws, to know where we come from, to know where we're going. It just makes us reach for the promise of America and for the promise of ourselves and for the promise of Jesus, right? But anyway, so when I look back, my book, if you don't know about it, is a lot of people think my book is a book about my father, and I can understand why they would think that. But to me, my book is a book that uses my father as a vehicle to talk about us. And when I think of this book, I did get an angry letter yesterday from a woman who grew up in one of my dad's churches. It was actually the worst review I've gotten in my book, and she said that she thought I was being unfair because you can't go back in 60 years and know anything, and I agree with that 100%. You can't go back in time and know with any degree of certainty what you would do. You can hope. you can't know how you would react to anything. You can't understand pressures, peer pressures, all these things that we hope we know. But what you can do is go back in time and look and see what happened, particularly where I'm coming from the person I love and admire the most, and see where there were failings and where there were successes. And you can use those to determine how you're going to react to the world today. And that's the goal in this. But I don't want to read much, but I want to read just one little bit about my dad, just so you'll know who he is. And my dad, to me, was, he's still up real high on a pedestal, I will say. He was the most principled person I ever met. He was the one who was always there for me. And I'm going to read, and I'll probably read this. It's not long, but I'm going to read this a little quickly, so forgive me if I read too fast. But I'm going to read. This is just in the middle of a chapter about how I remember my dad. I remember him with a harmonica in his mouth and a grin somehow still on his face. I think of him standing on the sidelines of Banks High School in Birmingham, watching me practice with my football team, interested but not interfering. I think of him coming to me after a brawl in which another boy got the worst of it, saying, "I don't want you to fight, but if you do, I'm glad you won." I think of him marching into the bathroom at my sister's high school with cleaning supplies to erase her name and number scrawled on the stall by some teenage punk. I think of him as a scoutmaster who remained for all of his life, an Eagle Scout. I think of him loving and accepting his children even when all four of them did things that caused him agony. Ooh, I forgot this part was in here. I remember him showing up unannounced and uninvited to a court hearing I did not think he knew about, in which I had to cop out loud to stealing a box of condoms from Big B Drugs. I threw myself on the mercy of the court and the mercy of Dad. He patted my knee in a silence I welcomed and appreciated. The only thing I remember him saying that day came after the hearing. "You know stealing is wrong," he said. And I nodded. "Right now, we're not even going to talk about what you took," for which I was grateful. Mostly I think of my dad in the outdoors, identifying birds and writing them down on a little spiral notebook he carried in his pocket. I think of him camping in a big blue tent, for he did not believe in hotels. He came from the same school of Methodism as the Finches and To Kill a Mockingbird, after all. The ones, as Harper Lee put it, wary of doing what was not in the glory of God, as the putting on of gold and costly apparel, or staying in hotels. Where I was closest to Dad, where I prefer to think of him most, is on a smooth little lake in the North Georgia mountains, with songbirds singing and dawn breaking to burn away the mist. Lake Hale sits on the property of Camp Glisson, a Methodist campground my mother's father helped found in the 1930s. We fly fished there nearly every year in a canoe that he most often paddled silently as I fished. Dad taught me with a chartreuse popping bug, a little wooden fly with rubber bands for wings. He taught me as a child patiently how to tie the fly onto the leader, how to draw out the line and whip it, all in the wrist, so it swept over the water like a flying insect and dropped gently inches from the bank where the little bass or brim gathered. If the flight is right, the fish will take notice before it even hits the water, and then with a little tug and a little shake, you make it judder through the water until, whoosh, the surface explodes with fish and fins and fury. Fly fishing on a lake is far different from what you see in rushing water, as in the river runs through it, ballet of trout and waders and baskets and hand-tied flies. It's less of an art, perhaps, but there's rhythm to the dance of fly fishing from a boat. Dad, like Norman McLean, said fly fishing was like life, patience and persistence and attention to detail and peace, and a thrill you cannot imagine. In the South, most anglers like to fish for large bass with a spinning rod, which for me is tricky. You must feel the fish, be one with the fish, keep your line taut and set the hook at just the right moment or the bass will make you look a fool. With fly fishing, though, there's no mistaking the intent of the fish. When it strikes, crashing the surface of a mirrored lake, the moment is obvious and unforgettable. It's a burst of adrenaline and a shock to the system. Oh, you still need practice, patience,
or you will, as the fish breaks the water, react so violently that you'll snatch the bug right out of its hungry mouth, sending it and the hook like a heat-seeking missile in the opposite direction. One of the first times Dad taught me fly fishing, I yanked my line out of the water too soon and, to make matters worse, jerked it straight toward my father. It soared over his head. When I realized my mistake, I whipped the tip forward again. The line changed directions and whistled through the air until the hook landed, thwack, right in the middle of Dad's bald spot. A big, bloody, bald bullseye. I don't recall exactly what he said. For Pete's sake, probably. Or bless Patty, not much more, I think, for he was a taciturn man. But he paddled to the bank to assess the damage. He told me to push the hook through the scalp and cut off the barb with a pair of dirty needle-nose pliers he kept in the tackle box. I couldn't do it, and I cried because I hurt him, because I didn't have the strength to help him, because I feared this thing we shared would be ruined by my own ineptitude. He laughed and scobbed my knob, as he called it, grabbing me by the neck and running his fist playfully through my hair. He told me not to worry, that there were still fish to catch. Sometimes you get stuck, and sometimes you do the sticking, but you don't stop. He handed me a new chartreuse fly and watched as I tied it onto my line just so. He paddled silently back out onto the lake, smiling with my fly still embedded in his head. I don't know how he got it out. I presume he stood in front of a mirror when we got home and pushed the barb on through the skin. But I don't know. Maybe he got my mom to do it. All I know is it wasn't the last time I hit him with a fly or stuck him with a hook. He didn't stop paddling me around the lake, but he did start wearing hats. Nothing mattered in those moments but the moments themselves. We were there, communicating without words, talking without speech, understanding each other in ways we never did anywhere else with anyone else. It was silent and spiritual. We rose early in the morning at dawn and slipped the canoe into the water without a sound. I'd climb in the front and he in the back, and without the need for instruction, we'd make our way through the fog and around the little lake. He'd see turtles on a log and point, or birds of prey in the sky and gesture excitedly toward them. Nothing thrilled him more than spotting a rare species or an animal outside its normal habitat. We'd smile and nod to each other at the sight of snakes or butterflies or neon dragonflies. He'd stop somewhere and paddle silently to the bank to examine a fern or wildflower or a tree he could not instantly identify, which was rare. When I caught all the fish I needed to catch, we'd switch places so I could paddle him around a time or two, so he could do some fishing himself. He could place a fly on a dime 6 inches from the bank. He could make it dance across the surface of the water. He could set the hook and pull a fish effortlessly into the boat. He was never as excited, though, as when I pulled a big fish, flipping and flopping and banging against the gunwale into the canoe. I used to think Dad loved fishing, and I suppose he did. It was only later, after I had my own kids, that I realized it was not the whole truth. What he really loved was fishing with me. In those moments, there was no need for talking or preaching or questioning or worrying about school or sermons or family or bills or any of the things that sometimes got in the way in real life. There were no worries but the fish and where they might gather and the perfect cast and perhaps hurtling hooks, thanks to me. In the end, it didn't matter if we caught fish. We mostly let them go anyway. It was simply understood. There are moments when you can say more in silence than you can ever say in words. There are other moments, though, when the world requires a voice. And that's the way I see my dad all the time. And that's the essence of this book, is sometimes the world requires a voice. And like I said, people say it's a book about my dad. I say it's a vehicle that uses my dad as the man I admire most to show us the way and the ways that do not work. I've been pleased in a lot of ways about. I was just mentioning I wrote this book in the spring of 2019. That's a white guy writing a book largely about race.
So you can imagine, as publication delayed from 2020 to 2021, that as I lay in bed, first of all, lying in bed wondering, am I being fair to my dad? Am I holding my dad to enough account? Am I somewhere in the spectrum? There's that. But there's also, as a white guy writing a book about race that publishes in 2021, are my words the right words? And whether I'll be misunderstood. But I've been pleased with that. But the nature of my questioning of this, I mean, it was very emotional for me because, again, I love this man. I love this man with everything I am, and this man was always there for me. And he taught me my whole beliefs in the world. He insisted that I go to integrated schools in 1971 in Decatur. He integrated a Cub Scout troop, all of these things later. So it was a shock to me to go back and, I was, sorry I digress. I was born in April of 1963 outside Birmingham, Alabama, when my dad was at Alabaster Methodist Church at the time. I was born 11 days before, I was born a week before Martin Luther King was taken to jail in Birmingham, arrested on charges of parading without a permit and put into solitary confinement. And 11 days after my birth, he wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail, which shockingly most people in Birmingham haven't read, but is one of the most profound documents of the civil rights movement and one of my favorite documents of all time. It not only lays out the need and the reason and the strategies for protest, but it excoriates the white church for its failure to speak out on issues of race at that time. As I said, I always thought that wasn't me, that wasn't us, because my dad was a great, my dad was a fairly prominent Methodist minister in North Alabama. His father was a fairly prominent Methodist minister in North Alabama. His father was a fairly prominent Methodist minister in North Alabama. My grandfather on my other side was a fairly prominent Methodist preacher in Georgia. I got an uncle and an aunt who are Methodist preachers. I got preachers going back all the way to 1750. And surely we were the good ones, which is what I always thought. So I never bothered, so my great regret in life. And again, when I first started, I said I want this to be a conversation. So my gosh, if you guys have questions, raise your hands, or I'll just keep talking. But I figured, we were on the right side. So I never had this conversation with my father that said, what were you saying from your pulpit in the cradle of the civil rights movement in one of the most critical times in the 20th century and the most critical times in my life moving forward? Because I thought I knew the answer. So he died in 2013, and in 2018 I started thinking about issues of silence a lot. Because quite frankly, particularly issues of white silence. Am I getting feedback there? Is there something I can do? Should I move away? There, is that better? All right. So I was thinking about silence. Well, white silence, thinking about, because, in Martin Luther King's letter, he talks about many things, including the white moderate who, is more frustrating than outright rejection. People have, well, I could quote it until right now. The people who agree with you in principle but do nothing else are much more frustrating than outright rejection. So I didn't know, and I thought that was all lost forever, that I'd never know, that I'd just have to imagine. And so then I went down in my basement and started looking for things. And I act like it's a grand search for truth. It's a grand search for truth, and my diligent reporting figured it all out. But in actuality, there were 2 file cabinets in my basement that had been sitting there for 5 years with the label in marker written across the front on white tape that said Daddy's Sermons in 2.5-inch letters. So I probably should have been able to figure it out soon. But I saw these 2 file cabinets and I started reading them, sermon by sermon. And these are things I did not pay that much attention to when I was young.
you can ask the people in the choir who liked me because I was the one who would hold up the watch from the balcony to tell them it was 12:15 because we have to beat the Baptists to the Pioneer cafeteria, so there was that. But I hadn't necessarily let them all, hadn't absorbed them all, shall we say, when I was young. But many of these were before I was even aware anyway. But I started, the first one I looked for, the first one I saw happened to be right there at the end of April 1963, that critical moment in time. It just happened to coincide with, on the Methodist church calendar, a day called Children's Sunday. It also happened to coincide with the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, in which thousands of children were being arrested and taken to jail for marching with Shuttlesworth and King for equality. And so it's a perfect moment in time to just take a dive in and say, what's Dad saying on Children's Sunday about children during the Children's Crusade? And it was a perfectly good sermon when I read it. It was perfectly fine. And that's all it was perfectly fine. And it talked about all the anguish and the trouble of the world. And it talked about trouble in Africa and Asia, Tanga, South America, everywhere but Birmingham, Alabama, everywhere but inside the congregation and inside or outside the stained glass windows. And it just struck me that, trouble is so much easier to deal with when it's somebody else's or when it's far away. And that's essentially what got me. And sorry, every time I say something, there's a caveat. I want everybody to know that I understand the differences in being paid like I am to say what you think all the time, which is like money in itself, A lot of people don't have that luxury. I don't have to keep a church together. I don't have to keep anything together. I don't have to keep people in the pews. I understand all these things. I understand that's a gift to me. But I also understand that the moments that I don't have a lot of regrets in life, even though I've got a lot of mistakes, because I feel completely that we are the sum of our scars, and we would not be who we are without those. But where I have regrets, there's those little moments where I did not stand up and speak for someone, that I did not stand up, and then there's some of those in the book. I mean, if I feel like I've been disloyal by my silence, if I feel I allowed someone to be hurt by my silence, those are the moments that drive me. It's not what I write a column a lot, and I say things when I look back that I wish I'd said differently or not at all. But it's still the moments of silence that bother me the most, because I feel like I have been disloyal or I have been traitorous or whatnot. But I digress again. But finding that initial sermon is what launched me on this sort of search for what I like to think of as a conspiracy of silence. And that is how so many world-changing things are allowed to go on around us that we don't do anything about. And in the 60s, that was epidemic in the churches and businesses and law offices, all over the place, and there's a lot of it in the book. And people told me time and time again, you got to understand that if he had spoken out from the pulpit on issues of race at that time, that he would have been relegated to small churches in the Methodist Church. He would have been subjecting us to violence. He would have not progressed up the, I'll call it a corporate ladder at the Methodist Church the way he should, and we would have suffered. He did it for you, they said. He did it for you. He did it for you. Which does not make me feel good, which makes me feel complicit, which makes me look further. And so that's essentially what this book really does, is it looks at the conspiracy of silence, why it happens, how it still happens, not just on issues of race, but on all those things we talked about earlier. in terms of LGBTQ issues, gay marriage issues, on some mental health issues. I think it's huge. We rarely talk about those things, particularly here, in ways that can make a real difference. We do better at times, and then we do worse. But it's those issues of silence that continue to bother me, because silence, as I was trying to say earlier, is one of those things I just keep thinking about. Because if you think from that letter from Martin Luther King, from the letter from jail, if you look back, I just keep thinking, if you look back, you could look back all the way to slavery, or to the 3 constitutions we wrote after Reconstruction, to the one we wrote in 1901 that was wrote specifically for the stated purpose of putting white supremacy into the code. If you look at Jim Crow, if you look at Tuskegee, if you look at people think this used to be called Birmingham because of the 16th Street church bombing, but that's not the case. It was Birmingham long before that. We had 40 bombs placed in this town between 1945 and 1965. The question I had for myself was, how many of those things could have been prevented if people of goodwill, and particularly white people of goodwill, said no, and simply said, this is not something we're going to do. The peer pressure was so strong in so many ways. Convention was so strong in so many ways that it made that very difficult. But all that does is remind us that peer pressure is always strong, and convention is always strong. And the only thing we can do to control it is to decide how we're going to react to it. And how we react to it every day doesn't depend on what happened in the past at all. What happened in the past doesn't affect us at all in that sense, in how we choose to react. How we choose to react is something we decide every single day. But knowing what happened in the past helps us inform our decision, so we'll know what we're going to do in that regard. And that's sort of the purpose of this. And again, I talk so much and go in so many directions. I'm sorry. What I really want to do is hear you guys, because the whole point of this book was, let's talk about these things in ways that we haven't really done a good job of talking. So, I mean, if you have experiences or thoughts on these issues, I would love to hear them, because of reactions to what I say, because that's what it's all about.
Oh, I want Doug to go first.
Oh.
Hey, John, I'm Doug Carpenter.
Hey, Doug. I love you, man.
I'm a generation ahead of you, but totally with you. Totally understand. I moved to Huntsville in 1963 when you were born. My son was born that year. I think you all moved there shortly after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, late 63.
We're on the same track. We're just a generation apart. And I sit here being totally involved with what you're saying, and I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's,
I was telling somebody, one of the greatest things about this book is that I've been able to talk to people whose families were involved in so many different ways in this question of when to speak and what to say and how to move us forward, and with people who have taken every bit of the spectrum of it. I think I might have mentioned to you, Doug, that I was talking to Jonathan Miller, a rabbi who was here for a long time, and who had talked about, his father had really taken the opposite sort of position of mine, which was to essentially, he was a rabbi in the Midwest and began to come down and it was essentially became a freedom writer. And when he was young, and he just talked about how the agony that created in his family, and urged me to sort of take a different look at it. But I just find that all the reactions so interesting, and the way we view them in the past. And the only thing, when I look at it, the only thing we can do is try to find empathy and understanding and more than anything else, use what we learn in our actions today, which is it's not anything other than that. How can we do it better?
One of the things that I wanted to say is we have a phrase in our liturgy about by his wounds we are healed. And I just wanted to remind you that we need to speak from our wounds, and that we will heal ourselves when we do that, and we will heal others. On the question of race, I graduated from high school in 1966 in Atlanta, and there were no black kids in my school. There were no black kids in my neighborhood. I had no frame of reference. Had no hatred, no anger in my family about blacks. We had a maid, but my mother thought they were friends. They invited my parents to their anniversary party at their church. So, I had good feelings. I went to University of North Carolina. Charlie Scott, entered UNC that year. First black basketball player. He was in my math class, and I'm sitting there thinking, dang, he's smart. And it was just so utterly new that I felt I was like a blank slate.
And that's a very real thing. And
Forgive me for calling it obliviousness, but there was an obliviousness epidemic. And I think that there still is. And that's one of the things that I get so bent out of shape about looking at our history. We have to know our history just to know, where we stand. But if you go, I can go out into, the same is true of the letter from Birmingham jail. What happened in Birmingham? If you grew up white in Birmingham, if you're my generation, you don't know what happened. And I didn't know that happened. I didn't know what happened until I was fully grown and had to do it for school, work, until I had to study it. Ask 100 Birmingham residents if they've read a letter from a Birmingham jail, and maybe 5 will, and they did it as part of some project. But the same is true with other events. I did a podcast last year on the shooting of Benita Carter, and the story is told very differently in black and white communities. And what we know, we don't all is not often, not always, what exactly happened. So, I think we have a real sort of duty to try to get an understanding of what happened and how it happened, if only to make sure it doesn't happen again. But you're right, and everything you said, my mom's from Atlanta, and everything you said, she was a good of heart, but she didn't have the frame of reference to know how to deal with it, and that's what we're trying to get at here too.
I'm from Selma, and I was born in 1971, and I did grow up with the frame of reference because I went to public high school, and it was 70% black, 30% white, but we still didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about, I was 6 years after 65, and it's amazing to me now. I'm grappling with the way that I grew up and how I was sitting right next to black kids, and we still didn't talk about it. And I read your book, and I was mad at you for the first half of the book because your dad was so great.
But were you at the end?
I was not mad at you anymore. Your book made me think in ways that I've always grappled with, but because of the silence. My dad is a great man. My grandfather was in the Episcopal Church in Selma and had to walk out of the vestry when they wouldn't let black people in. So they were on the right side of history, but did they do enough? No. No. Because they lived in a community that didn't appreciate that. So, but it still is amazing to me that I didn't read the letter from the Birmingham jail until after I read your book. For the first time in 50 years growing up in Selma and Birmingham. It's amazing.
the focus of your book is all these excerpts, quotes from sermons, and kind of what's going on at the same time. And one of the things that I've had to reflect on a lot in the last few years is the power that's kind of held and it's unfair in the pulpit, because there's not an opportunity for others to respond. And so one of the strategies, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, I think I worry that I don't say enough most of the time, but we try to have more challenging conversations in here because it gives people a little bit, and so I'm just curious, there may not be the records because the sermons are recorded. You know, what were the conversations happening in Sunday school at the different Methodist churches? Are there records of those? I mean, I think there's more to the story.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any way of finding out.
I've done quite a bit.
And you know, it varies. It varied according to time, and in the 1960s, it was a lot tougher. And again, I think, you know, in one-on-one conversations, he was always showed more strength. I think that, most churches are this way, or particularly were, but I think still are. But Methodist churches are very politically this way, in that there was a huge, it was a given that you don't talk about politics from the pulpit. There was a lot of pressure not to talk about politics from the pulpit. So we focus on the spiritual nature of each of us as we sit in the sanctuary and sing beautiful hymns and look at beautiful stained glass windows and look internally at our souls, I suppose, with only passing reference by parable to things that are happening outside. And I personally have sort of issues with that. I understand it. I understand the need for it, but as you know, as somebody I quoted in the book talked about, you know, the Bill Nicholas, that the decision to have the decision to keep politics out of the pulpit is essentially a political decision. And so, as long as we understand that and know, certainly we've seen cases where it's gone horribly wrong to have a lot of politics in the pulpit. And so we fully understand that. But I mean, it's a good point. And I wish I could know a lot of those things that aren't recorded and written down and saved. I do know that I have no doubt in my mind that when push come to shove and he would have to make a decision, it would be a principled decision that I don't believe would disappoint me. But it's a hard thing. I mean, it's harder every day I think about it because again, I feel like we're reliving these things in a lot of ways right in this very moment in time. And it becomes clearer and clearer that simply talking more loudly about them is not the answer. How we go about talking to people may be the answer. But for me, again, it's not a matter of saying, you know, you should believe this or that, because you're never going to argue somebody into believing like you do. But to simply acknowledge this is what I believe within your own personality, within your own sense of self, using the words that you would use and not some talking point that somebody else would give you. Those are the things that I think are important. Just to just acknowledge that you stand for something you believe to be right.
I don't know if you were here to hear any of John's sermon. It's interesting how this sort of dovetails with what John preached on this morning. He talked about sometimes words can be harmful and can be disruptive, and sometimes the best way to preach is with our actions and not with our words. I grew up in North Alabama, and in the 7th grade, our school was integrated for the first time.
Where were you?
That was in Florence, Alabama. So my mother grew up in that community, and she preached one of the most powerful sermons just with her life and the way she treated people. And the story that I remember about that was in the midst of much of the conflict and the uproar of the civil rights movement. She was driving home from work one day in her 56 Ford, and a neighbor of ours who lived just down the road from where we lived out in the country was walking away from his truck that was broken down, and she stopped and picked him up and took him home. This neighbor was a black man, and she was a bit late getting home from work, and I remember this conversation she had with my dad, and he was worried. He said, "What will people think?" And my mom said, "I don't really care, he's my neighbor." And that message was a really powerful sermon, and that's how she treated other people. And she wasn't being self-righteous or anything, but this was her neighbor. And I think that's one way. I mean, clearly being in a place where you have a voice that's outsized because you're in a pulpit or, writing a column or, in a political position. But many of us don't have that. But we do have ways we can treat our neighbors, and that's something that, that I remember pretty powerfully from that era.
It's a great story, and I agree.
That 100%. I do. I do think, I do think that, as I've said way too many times, I think. But if you do have we all have pulpits. Let's face it, we do. But some of them are outsized, as you put it, and I do think that with that comes a responsibility at times. Unless if you got a flock, you should lead them in the right direction, And so that's, I feel strongly about that. But I also, I'm conflicted about that so much because actions, words, there's a place for both.
Yeah, second native of Selma, and I grew up in the First Presbyterian Church. It was called the Church Under the Clock. And I want to relate a religious experience because I graduated in 1957 from Abbott Parish High School. Very fine high school. We would, on Sunday, it was a big, large church, spatially wise, and it had a upper level in the back. And if you walked up there, you could hear the footsteps, clunk, clunk, clunk. Well, one experience that sort of, I was trying to interpret this as a high school student. They would come in, protesters would come in, they had a regular schedule just before the sermon, and clunk, 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 clunk. And church had, my father was an elder in this Presbyterian church. They had to wrestle with how do we respond. And they decided just let them do it. They would sit down and stay through the sermon and then go out. So that was their response to interruption, if you would. I've not been in another church, not even in the armed forces, where there was that kind of intrusion of noise. And I just want to share that. I've wrestled with that for years. And I have a lot of other observations. My grandfather was a country doctor in Settle, Alabama. That's Perry County.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Settle was the landowner, and my grandfather had a little white office which existed up for the last 10 years. I don't know whether it's still there, but it was next to the grocery store. His job as a doctor was take care of all the employees. There were money appropriated to give transportation and aid to doctors in the rural area. That's developed here in the last year. So that's two different eras.
Yeah, a lot of the same problems exist in that part of the state that did before.
Thing is relationships between my grandfather and he had employees. He'd take care of his car and everything else. They were very, very good. And, my favorite African American friend then was a fellow named Verge. He illegally produced liquor.
We know why he's your favorite, huh?
Other than that, he was a straight and kind man and would love you. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, it all gets very
complicated, and it's really difficult because again, time is a different sort of thing, and but again, you have your hand. I'm babbling.
Oblivious, I think, was a great word. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, and had my formative years on the campus at Alabama when George Wallace made his stand. And the campus was totally okay with integration. I went on to become a teacher and was teaching while my husband was in law school, and happened to be my first year of teaching was when the high school, Tuscaloosa High School was integrated. And I think having that experience of actually the personal experience of seeing the students that came into my classroom that had not had the privilege of being in a better school, it changed me forever. Because I saw them the next year, how they progressed and how the students interacted with them. There were no problems in that school when it happened. And I think change only comes from personal experience.
My wife and I talk a lot about we feel like we were in sort of the golden age of integration. Like I said, my second grade also integrated in the 1970, whatever, 70. And I went to integrated schools through 1981 when I graduated high school. When I graduated high school at Banks in East Birmingham, which is no longer there, it was like 50-50 black and white. And it was a great experience for me. I loved it. The next year it was 51% black, so then 5 years later it was all black. And then, 10 years after that, they shut its doors. So, we tended to resegregate. It took us longer. It took us, 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education to integrate schools in Alabama, essentially. And then 15 years after that, we had resegregated ourselves largely. So I feel like a lot of people miss that sort of opportunity. And I feel like, the more we can have contact with each other and get to know each other as people, then the more hope we have for humanity. And that's, not an original thought, but it's one that I truly believe. But anyway, so, yeah.
Can you run another time?
Right time.
Okay.
Say after.
Well, I was just going to say this book resonated with me so much because I was born in 1960. My dad, Ward McIntyre, probably was he was at Birmingham Southern the same time your dad was. And I just kept thinking it was really about courage and the cost of courage, because you did mention those people in the clergy that did something for what they did. And Chuck Moore did, who I worked for and knew quite well.
He's a great hero of mine.
Yeah, and he spoke up the day after the church bombing at the Young Men's Business Association and basically said, it's because of us. We are responsible. And the Klan ran him out of town. So, it's just about courage and how hard it is for people to be courageous.
And
Thank you. That's what I felt whenever anybody said, he was doing it for you. He was doing it for you. That's. I just couldn't help thinking of people like John Lewis getting beat in the head as they crossed the Methodist Bridge, or Shuttlesworth getting beat as he tried to integrate Phillips High School, or guys sending his kids to integrate Graymont. I mean, that's courage, and we find, but it also takes courage to say to somebody you love, who disagrees with you about something, or who may have misinformation about something, that this is it's particularly in a kind way, that you disagree, because sometimes it's as hard to just break ranks as it is to do something that you gear yourself up to be courageous about, and so it's all those things. But thank you.
But I encourage you, if you want to reach John at the end, as we kind of make your way out, if you have a copy of this book you'd like him to sign, I see a few of you do. He said he's happy to do that. And so let's give John our thanks for being here.